Hey guys, how's it going? Welcome to this video about general tanking basics, FF14, and let's just get into this. It's mostly just about basics that you should carry through from the beginning all the way to your end. Most of the times I see tanks maybe not using this or something like that, but it's generally a good guideline and like just tips of what things you should know and learn within tanking. If you've chosen this role as your essential main role in FF14, know that most of your battles are very different from a healer or a DPS's role within same fights. Being a tank, there are pretty much exclusive mechanics that are only that you can deal with, like tank busters for instance, or certain like mitigation damaging things that only you should take in later raids and also boss fights, even early ones, like say for instance level 50 Extreme Ramu. If you do it on synced, then you can actually still fail that a lot because you have to swap aggro with another tank for like the runs that have at least 2 tanks in them. So for instance, we'll just go over the traditional skills that all the tanks possess, which is the roll skills. There's Rampart, Low Blow, Provoke, Interject, Reprisal, Arm's Length, and Shirk. A lot of these skills you'll be using throughout most of your gameplay all throughout, except for maybe Shirk until very late. Shirk doesn't really have much use in a lot of the fights that I've met all the way to level 80 essentially. Maybe you've only seen it used twice in in like some extremes in the very high-end areas. Or for instance, like the example I made earlier with Ramu Extreme or whatever, you might want to toss your enmity to the other tank so that Ramu actually attacks the other tank and not one-shot you for instance. Because there's like a mechanic there where you have to shave off the enemy aggro to somebody else. In the previous video I made about like something just getting into FF14, if you haven't done the Hall of Novice, it has a lot of good tips in there as well, so you should probably complete that if you haven't yet. The Hall of Novice for tank, and just do all these exercises. They at least give you an idea of all of them for one class. I don't know why it says only one here. I'm pretty sure I did all of them. But so for Rampart, most tanks have 2 mitigations as they level up. You'll notice that early on you won't have too many skills. The game doesn't try to overwhelm you with like all these skills that you have to use later on. But as you go through it, the game will add more and more layers of extra functionality to a point where you might start getting overwhelmed, because on top of having to get your skills involved, you still have to also manage the boss or maintain aggro and deal with their mechanics as well. So when you have the 2 things meshed together on top of other players that you also have to sort of tank damage for, it becomes very overwhelming to some, and others it could be just normal. But early on it's not too bad. Just one thing to know is that in terms of your skills, don't cast your mitigations back to back or on top of each other. They do not really stack very well. So for instance, Rampart gives you 20% damage reduction, and then I have another skill here called like Shadow Wall, which reduces damage by 30%. So some might question, like, it doesn't really explain that like these 2 do not add up into 50% if you just use both of them at the same time. It's sort of like a multiplicative difference, so you'd only at most yield maybe like 36 or 37% damage reduction for 15 seconds to 20 seconds. It would be far more effective if you used Rampart or the Shadow Wall first, but not both of them at the same time. When one runs out, you toggle the other one if you really need to extend like the maximum amount of damage reduced as a barrier. As well, this also has a shorter cooldown too, so you might want to trigger the shorter cooldown one first and use this one for heavier hits, assuming you have knowledge of your enemy. If you do not have knowledge of your enemy, then like, yeah, as a tank you probably will eventually start learning the tactics of your enemy very quickly, because you're kind of forced to as the person who has to hold aggro on the bosses. So that's the first skill. Rampart is damage taken by 20%, Shadow Wall 30%. Don't stack them, just use them like back to back if you really need to mitigate a lot of stuff. And then there's skills that some classes have, like Magic Vulnerability by 20%. Something that's not really explained is like, what is a magic attack versus like a physical attack. So for instance, the warrior has Vengeance, which returns damage on physical attack. So it's physical attacks, I guess. There's not really a discernible difference, but most of the time, by general rule of thumb, if a boss or enemy is swinging its arm or weapon at you, that's a physical attack. And then anything that's like magic or like shouting or like a boss screaming or something or whatever, that's all considered magical attack. But that's just another way to like figure it out. So that's, but then like for Rampart and like just the action itself, when it just says reduces damage, that's pretty much damage across the board. So don't worry too much about that, but only for like specific skills like that. For other tanks like that have block, for instance, like Paladins and Gunbreaker, Gunbreaker has this skill called Camouflage, which you already know once you unlock Gunbreaker. It increases parry rate and reducing damage taken by 10%. So this is like a 10% damage reduction, I believe, unless I'm reading this wrong. On top of like the parry rate generally can block an extra 15 to 20% some odd damage. I know it's at least another 10 to 15% damage. I don't know if 20 is correct, but it sort of ranges for some reason depending on where. I'm not really too sure on the transparent mechanics on it. I just know that it's an additional like percentage damage reduced, much like the Paladin's block. The Paladin's block also has something that can be triggered very often, which is the Sheltron. It block incoming attacks. It pretty much triggers the block to enable for like 6 seconds on every single hit. I believe it's shorter in lower levels where Sheltron is only 4 seconds instead of 6. So that's another action that just to keep in mind of, like to sort of swap. That parry and block rate I believe stacks on top of the Rampart and stuff like that, so I feel like Paladins are tankier in some sense to that degree, but it's a very short duration. You mostly want to channel this in between if you can. Again, extending your mitigations is far better than stacking them. And then low blow is a good skill for like low-end enemies. Say for instance, you always want to use this whenever you can, just to check if an enemy can actually be stunned. You'd be surprised that some bosses might actually be able to be stunned early on, and it'll completely cancel mechanics altogether, and you just wail on the boss like a forehead instead, so you don't have to worry about like the boss doing anything sneaky or anything special. Just throw it in anyways, and you know, you might be surprised that like it might just trip, or even a strong foe. There's stronger foes that seem like they're bosses, but they're not really. Especially if you're doing something like high-end Palace of the Dead or high-end Heaven on High, but that's like very later on, beyond 50 kind of content. You'd be surprised that some huge monsters can actually be stunned, and then you just wail on them like they're nothing instead of going like, oh my god, they're gonna two-shot me kind of thing. So just give it a check, and even then, like when you're kiting a lot of monsters, using this on a monster is pretty much removing an enemy out of combat for 5 seconds. So you're taking less damage still. It's still part of damage reduction in your regular dungeon runs, which you'll be doing a lot of early game. And I think it's very, very useful, on top of the cooldown being relatively short for 25 seconds. It's the enemy is going to be stunned again within 20 seconds since the duration is 5 on that first hit. Another thing to like know about like stuns and like crowd control effects like this that are very powerful, like stuns are very strong, is that when you reapply them, the duration gets divided by half each time, and then once it reaches immunity, it's immune for a full minute. So once it's at a full minute, you cannot like crowd control an enemy anymore. There's other ways about this for certain enemies with particular attacks. And then Provoke, you should definitely have this on your bar in case you ever need to just yoink an enemy from like a very far distance away. The Provoke ability is the farthest ranged attack that a tank has to draw an enemy to where they are. So this 25 yalm range is far higher than like a shield toss that Paladins or like Dark Knights and Gunbreakers and Warriors have. So it's only 15 range, but the Provoke is like far higher, and it'll also place you at the top of the list. So if you're an off tank, for instance, and your main tank falls and you didn't have your tank stance on, make sure you use Provoke so you actually take the boss to your aggro before it starts dropping like your entire party one by one, and then you all fail, and then you all have to redo everything again. Because sometimes you can recover, most of the time you can recover if there's still another tank alive kind of thing. So this is a very good skill to have on your hotbar. Definitely put it on there. Interject is another skill that I see a lot of tanks not use sometimes in early game. It's also because it's not the tank's fault or the player's fault. It's just that this description is not very descriptive of what it means. Interrupts the use of a target's action. So you should definitely have this on your bars. For enemies that can't be stunned, sometimes they use actions that can actually be interrupted, and their casting progress bar would be red and flashing is the indicator that it can be interrupted. Don't wait to use this. If you can see an action that is easily interrupted and it's a super long cast, interrupt the enemy right away. It won't set them off to do their next action. They'll actually stand around there like an idiot, as if they're still casting their thing until it's complete. So if you interrupt it early, they'll just stand there for a while wondering like what's going on, even though you interrupted their skill and they're actually free to act, but they don't. Because it thinks it's still casting, so it's just standing there doing nothing. I've seen some people try to like interrupt something like when the bar's almost complete, thinking that the enemy stunned itself for the longest time, but then they miss and then the cast actually goes off and everybody just gets kablooey. So Interject is a very, very useful skill. Another class that would possess an ability to do such as this is a physical range DPS. But other than that, tanks have this, and you do need to learn to use this, so definitely put it on your hotbar. The earlier you learn to use this in actions against bosses, the better. You always want to interject first before you stun if the enemy can be stunned. If the enemy can be stunned, then stun. But if they can be interjected, you want to interject first because it's not counted as a crowd control or anything. It's literally just an action cancel if the action is cancelable. And certain extreme bosses I've seen, I think there was like one of the bosses, they have like a very scary mechanic, but then if you interrupt it, he just stands there and does nothing. But then a lot of tanks early on, I think it's like a level 60 or a level 50 boss, a lot of tanks didn't know how to interject at that point yet still, or they didn't understand what to look for. And then the boss is like standing there for like 8 seconds casting this thing. 8 seconds is a very long time. And then it goes off, and then we have to deal with like all these crazy mechanics and bubbles and everything spawning everywhere, when a tank or a physical range DPS could just use this and skip all of it. But like, don't rely on the physical range DPS. They should be looking out for it anyways, but like, you should also use this as much as you can whenever you can, and work your timings in. So it's an off global cooldown, so it won't interrupt with your attack combos as well. Reprisal is another skill that should be used very, very often. It's 10% damage dealt reduced. It can only be applied one time on a boss or a target, or like multiple targets. It's an AoE around yourself. It reduces damage around everything that's tagged by 10%. It applies to everything. I have not seen a single monster in this game that cannot suffer this effect. The only problem is that only one of this effect can exist on an enemy, so you cannot stack this with like multiple tanks and suddenly drop an enemy's damage like enormously. Only one effect. So if you see another tank have Reprisal and that debuff icon on a boss, for instance, you want to chain yours to go after theirs, or like start yours off first and then hope the other tank catches on and notices it and then chains his afterwards. So you have like, instead of a 10-second duration or a refresh duration, you actually have a full 20 seconds of like 10 and 10. Something like that. So just to keep in mind, very useful for against like AoE raid hits or whatever, or like a tank buster where all your mitigations are gone, for instance, like they're on cooldown and you're waiting for them to cool down. So this is like an extra resort. That 10% can help, especially if there's healers around that also have like their own mitigations, like Scholar, White Mages, or Astrologian that can grant barriers or regen. So it'll help mitigate everything together as a party to help lower the damage on you in general. So things, you should use this very, very often. It's a very short cooldown. It's 60 seconds. The duration is 10. Usually there's only a 50-second in between downtime, so the first 10 seconds is obviously applied. And then if your other tank uses it as well after yours, then there's only a 40-second gap before it can be triggered again, which is really quick in the scheme of things, especially when like the boss doesn't use tank busters back to back to back to back. It's just, sometimes it's like a raid wide tank buster, and then you might fulfill a reprisal with both of those things in there, and then like a lot of damage is gone. So for instance, like Ramu, for instance, when you take 3 of the lightning orbs and he does shock strike, it still hits really hard. It's like a quarter or like 1/3 of your health, and if you don't even have the 3 orbs, he just one-shots you anyways. But that's like, it's really scary, and that's just a level 50 synced dungeon. Obviously most people run that unsynced, but if you want that experience, you can go and try that with some people who are willing. So that's another idea. Arm's Length is a skill that a lot of new tanks don't know too well. You should actually have this on your hotbar all the time, because you will need this for later runs, and it's just in the early runs it doesn't have too much use up until you hit like some of the later bosses, like Leviathan, for instance, early on, where he slams the floor and you slide across the boat platform kind of thing. You can use this and actually mitigate that and just walk as if nothing happened, as an instance for use early on. But later on you want to use this a lot, And even then, like, this is a very big bonus for early dungeons as well. The additional effect of that 20% slow when barrier is struck, it means that you have a 6-second window when you use this to slow your enemies down when they hit you by 20%, which effectively means all their actions are 20% slower. So the damage coming into you is far slower than normal, and basically you can like delay the damage even more and kite more monsters in this fashion. And it lasts 15 seconds, which is very long, and hopefully by then all the mobs that you're facing will be dead. So that's for early dungeons. It has a very high function use that a lot of people don't use, that I've noticed throughout my journey, and it has a very useful skill that I believe all tanks should use. Even physical DPSs that have this as well should also use this in case a tank falls down, and maybe try to delay the death as long as possible, or the wipe in a dungeon run in the early dungeons. And you might actually make it out of there alive with just a healer, and your tank like respawns and recovers from a resurrection or something. So those are just like some role skills that I believe like you should know about. You should definitely put into practice from beginning all the way to very end game, because these concepts carry you from literally the beginning of the game all the way to the very end. Shirk, again, I haven't really found too much of a use for this, and I'm sure there's like some higher end raids where it does require you to use this. But I have not experienced very much of that, because like most of the time when the two tanks are in sync and on the same page, like if the tank actually needs to take enmity, they will just provoke the boss and place themselves at the top of the enmity list, so that the main tank or off tank doesn't have to offshore the enmity to them, for instance. Unless like there's like one boss where they throw so much mechanics where you actually have to throw it and then the provoke's on cooldown kind of thing. So this one, not too much use, unfortunately. But that's pretty much it. Video's already kind of long. I just wanted to show you some also like live examples as well in my own runs, as to like just throwing mitigations back to back, and also like chaining things and concepts together to show you like you can do like some maddening things as a tank. Obviously you still have to work with your healer though, because without that you're just going to be a dead piece of meat on the floor. So do be mindful, and don't be like too intimidated by things. Be confident, like you are basically the forefront of like the entire party. Most of the time you control the rhythm and tempo of a fight or the run, and most of the time things will go well as long as you keep a positive outlook. All right, so thanks so much for watching, and here's some examples, and I'll see you next time. Peace.